Sorry about that. Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to a study on broadwing hawks. I know you guys are just starting to see broadwing hawks heading over your watch site there. We've been seeing them for a few weeks. We already have some breeding birds back on territory. The study I'm going to talk to you about today is a comprehensive study that we've been involved with for about 6 or 7 years. I'm not going to be able to talk about everything related to broadwings, but hopefully you'll ask me questions and we can try to discuss some of that during the question and answer session. Okay, why up there? Sorry about that. First thing I'd like to do is just thank all the funders of the study. This is a very big research study that we've been doing, and it takes a lot of support. In the early years, we were funded through a state grant and with matching funds from Audubon and a few other places. But more recently, we've been doing all our work with private donations. So I want to really thank those folks. And then we're gearing up right now for an additional research area in New Hampshire and also in Connecticut that is funded by the Northeast Hawkwatch and the Western Connecticut Bird Club, as well as some other donors. So none of that would be possible without our supporters. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is research that's been done in collaboration with a number of people. I particularly want to highlight Rebecca McCabe, who conducted her master's research with me on broadwing hawks and is also continuing as a research associate. So lots of stuff going on. And if I forget to mention the names, these are the folks that we need to thank. Okay, so why did we start studying broadwing hawks? Well, as you guys are standing there watching these swirling kettles of broadwings going over your head, I'm sure that you're thinking about questions or discussing them with your fellow hawk watchers, like where are those birds going? Where are they coming from? How long did it take to get there? I wonder what they're doing when it's raining outside and that kind of thing. So there's a whole host of questions. And at Hawk Mountain, the broadwing hawk is our most numerous migrant. Nearly half of the 20,000 or so raptors that we see in a fall season are broadwing hawks. So learning more about this species is really, really important to our mission and to what our members are asking about as they sit there and watch the raptors going overhead. Now, just to start a little bit by the general background on broadwing hawks that's been known for some time, which is we know that broadwing hawks are forest nesting birds. They're distributed throughout this blue area on the map here. They nest throughout eastern North America, around the Great Lakes. And in recent years, they've been expanding their range westward. They actually nest into British Columbia now. So that means, of course, that western migration sites are seeing increases in migrating broadwings. The other thing that we know about broadwings is they are what we call a complete migrant, which means that all of the broadwings leave their nesting area and migrate to a discrete wintering area, which you can see here in orange. So we know they winter in Florida and they also winter from Central America south. So as I mentioned, they are complete migrant, and they are considered a long distance neotropical migrant because they are crossing into the tropics on that migration. So just like the warblers that we're starting to see return here, they are a long distance neotropical migrant. Another reason that they're very popular with hawk watchers is they form these large flocks or kettles. So they are incredibly concentrated on their migration. This is just a few examples of peak numbers at different sites. In Pennsylvania, we're lucky to have 20,000 in a day. That would be really amazing. Up in Michigan, where you guys are, Detroit River commonly can get 60,000 or more in a day. And then as you move south in Texas and Mexico, the numbers that you can see in one day proportionally just increase and increase as the birds collect on their way south. And this concentration, if you graph the timing of migration across the entire continent, you can see how concentrated they are. No matter what part of the migrations window that you're looking at, the birds are very or where you are, no matter where you are in the geography of the migration, the birds are incredibly concentrated, and even more concentrated as they go south. You can see here in Veracruz, most of the birds are coming through in 1 week. Now, the annual cycle of the broadwing hawk has been mapped or graphed in the Birds of the World publication. And you can see here, this is a little bit complicated, but you can see the letters refer to the months. So January, February, March, April, May, going around in a circle all the way to December. And the outer rim shows what is known about migration timing in broadwing hawks. So you can see broadwing hawks are shown to be migrating from early March through early May, predominantly in the spring, and then in the fall from mid-August through early November. So we're going to talk about that later. I just wanted to point that out, that this is kind of our state of thought about broadwing migration as of 5 years ago. One thing I also want to point out is, when are broadwings molting? Molting is a time when birds actually are going under some physiological stress. They're trying to replace their flight feathers and their body feathers. And if you note here that the molt, which is the inner circle, broadwing hawks are mostly molting in the late summer, July, August, and early September. And we'll refer to that later. Well, one reason that Hawk Mountain got involved in this project is that we were looking at data that was collected from Hawkwatch sites across the country and compiled in the Raptor Population Index project in 2014. And this is the graphic that we were looking at. You could see there were a number of down arrows, significant declines, particularly in Eastern North America. And that was a concern to us. Out of 9 sites, almost half of them were showing us a long-term 20-year decline. So there was some kind of regional decline being indicated by the hawk migration counts. And more recently, through the more recent analysis in Raptor Population Index, we can see while a lot of sites are showing stability, we're still seeing, particularly along the Appalachian corridor, a lot of declines in the migrant counts. In addition to the migration count trends, we were also seeing here in Pennsylvania some regional declines in nesting birds. And this was shown because we had 2 different time periods for the Breeding Bird Atlas. We had one in the 1980s and one in the 2010s. And you can see we're in these red circle areas, there's concentrations of yellow. So anywhere on the Pennsylvania map where there's a yellow block, that means there were birds nesting there in the 80s, but that are no longer there. And of course, in the blue here is the birds were present in the 2000s and not in the 1980s, or at least not detected. So what this summarized to be is that we had concentrations of declines, particularly around areas that are going through suburbanization or urbanization, Philadelphia being in the southeast and Pittsburgh in the west. So for these reasons, we decided we would like to conduct further research on the broadwing hawk and do a full life cycle study, which means studying the birds during the nesting season, during the migration, as well as during the wintering season. And to do that, when you're talking about a long distance migrant, we have to bring in some pretty special technology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our findings from the nesting studies that we've done, but not everything. And I'm going to focus mostly on migration and talk a little bit at the end about what we're seeing on wintering grounds, but we're still delving into some of these data. So where did we do our research? It was a Pennsylvania-based study, and we wanted to look at what was happening in some of these areas that were undergoing decline. So we had a study here in the southeastern part of the state. And right here in the middle is Hawk Mountain. Of course, we were doing research there, and well as 2 areas of Pennsylvania that have pretty high density of forest in the northwest and the northeast. So we had 4 different study areas. We were studying birds during the breeding grounds and trying to trap them to study the migration. So a little bit about our nesting studies. We did a lot of observations of nests, both using cameras. You can see in this lower photograph of a video camera is focused on a nest, as well as observers hidden behind screens to take observations directly through telescopes. And so we would do these observations during the breeding season, from incubation all the way through through fledging and take data on both adults and immatures. So one of the key things we wanted to look at was kind of to see whether in some of these areas that are fragmented, what were we seeing different prey types being brought in, which might indicate that there's some stress to the nesting pair if they're having trouble finding prey. So we were taking data on adult behavior, how much time they spent at the nest, what times that food they brought in, as well as nest material. You can see this female here has got a stick she's adding to the nest, and the parental care. And basically what we found, I'll give a quick summary, is that broadwing hawks eat a wide variety of prey items: mammals, frogs, snakes, birds, a lot of baby birds taken out of nests, but mostly mammals. The chipmunk was their most favored food item in this area. And if we break that down into proportions, they're bringing in about 3 different prey items a day to the nest sites, and about 12% of them were eastern chipmunks, which is pretty amazing. And large proportion of them were mammals. That's the purple bar here, purple pie. The birds was about 20%, and reptiles and amphibians were about 11%, which is less than some of the historical studies that were done up along the Great Lakes had found. They found higher proportions of amphibians. But we had pretty good proportions of snakes coming in as well. So the key message is we had a wide variety of prey items. We did not see any differences in the different regions. They were all pretty much showing similar prey items. So I'd also like to share a little bit about habitat use, because that has relevance to the migration discussion. And so we wanted to look at what kinds of habitats the birds were selecting. And to do this, we put 1 kilometer circles around each nest site, and then measured the proportion of habitat around that, within that circle. And we used a 1 kilometer radius circle because that's about the distance between nests that we were studying in our most concentrated study area at Hawk Mountain, that they were spaced out about that distance. And what we found is that broadwings are typically nesting in areas of heavy forests, 79% or 80% on average forested areas, with a pretty good proportion of evergreen, 26% evergreen, which is higher than you would find by random points. So they seem to select out areas with some evergreen component. But also wetlands, higher, 9% of the area was some kind of wetland, which is ponds or streams. And that was also higher than what you would find on a random forest plot here. So wetlands and forest, particularly evergreen or mixed forest, was pretty important to these birds. And of course, in our study, we were trapping and banding birds to put telemetry units on them, but we also did some color banding. And one of the things that's really interesting about broadwings is they're very faithful to their breeding territories. They come back year after year after year. So I'm pretty sure that when they don't return, they probably didn't survive, but we don't know that for sure. But we have some birds that we've been following for 5 or 6 years now. So one of the key questions was to understand migration ecology. There's a lot of unknowns about migration ecology in broadwing hawks. Most of what we know is from ground-based observers watching migration or radar or something like that. So we wanted to really get an in-depth understanding of what the birds are doing, if they're stopping, are they showing any sign of feeding, that kind of thing along the way. And of course, threats, try to quantify threats and conservation challenges the birds may be facing. So these are some of the things with basic biology that we just wanted to understand, and I'll be sharing with you today is how does migration differ between adults and young birds, males and females? And then something that we're just starting to get into now is comparing Pennsylvania birds to other birds from other regions. So how do we get transmitters or bands on broadwing hawks? If you're a bird trapper, or by nature, you know broadwings don't usually come in at migration banding stations. They usually ignore those things. So the best way to get a satellite unit or a band on a broadwing is to trap the birds at their nest sites. So what we would do is go out and find the nest sites and then set up our trapping with a great horned owl, fake great horned owl and a mist net around it, and then play the call. And then the adults, which don't like great horned owls because they're nest predators, would come and dive into the net, hopefully, although it really only worked about 20% of the time. So here we are in our setup. We have our fake great horned owl in the lower left here. This is actually after trapping a bird. They're processing it. So we use a mechanical, we're now using a mechanical great horned owl, which has movable head and wings so that we can make it more lifelike. And then of course we're sitting in a blind playing the call, and when the bird gets into the net, we immediately jump out and grab it out of the net. To get juveniles, we had to climb the nest tree, so we worked with a tree climber to get to the nest site. But we only did that in 2014. The satellite transmitters, I don't know if you've seen them before. They look like this. They sit on the back of the bird, and they're attached with like a backpack Teflon ribbon harness that's been well documented over the years to not interfere at all with the feathers or cause any scrapes or anything. It's very, very soft ribbon and very durable. The whole unit is weighed less than 3% of the body weight. So in order to do that, we were only tagging females with a 9.5 grams of transmitter that weighed at least 380 grams, and males, the male transmitter that we used was much smaller, 5 gram unit. And we only trapped and tagged 2 males. We had some issues with the transmitter, but I'll talk about that later. So in 2021, we're going to switch to a different unit altogether, and I can talk about that later as well. But for this study that I'm going to talk about, these are the units that we were using. They are solar powered, which means the battery only lasts a certain amount of hours until it needs some kind of solar energy charge. And the downside of that is when they're in the tropical rainforest, they don't get any sun. That we can go for months or without getting any signal until they get soaring above the forest again. So over the course of the years since 2014, we have put out about 19 different satellite units here in Pennsylvania. I'm also going to be sharing some data from 3 adult birds that were tagged in Alberta, Canada by some colleagues of ours. And then in addition to the females, we did have 2 units on males that I'll discuss. There's just a photograph of Jesse Watson. He's with the Migratory Bird Connectivity Project, Smithsonian, and this is one of the Western broadwings that he tagged. Okay, and then this past spring, despite COVID, we were able to get up to Canada, which we had one of our folks, Rebecca McKay, was up in Canada already, and worked with some trappers up there, Charlotte, England, and Malcolm, and we trapped 3 broadwing hawks on the north side of the lakes in May. And our hope was that we were going to be able to follow these birds, and I'd be talking about their amazing migration route now, but unfortunately all 3 transmitters failed on us, which is part of why we're switching to a new design. But we did get some information on their breeding movements. We have data from May through August, so we do have some information on habitat use that we can look at. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're learning about broadwing hawk movements and migration from all this effort. First of all, there's a ton of data that we're just starting to get into on breeding habitat use. We usually would put the unit on the bird in June. We don't tag the birds when they're on eggs. We wait until they have young in the nest and the young are old enough that they're self-regulating their temperatures. So then we would put up the great horned owl in mid to late June and get the females. So the first year we'd have late season data, but then if we have a bird like Rosalie here, who nests at Hawk Mountain, and it's named for Hawk Mountain founder Rosalie Edge, you can see, I don't know if you can see, she's got a band on her leg and the telemetry antenna is sticking off the back. We had several years of data from Rosalie, and you can see that she's using this core area heavily, but then occasionally taking forays, probably to go to the river to look for prey items and things like that. But it works out to be about a 700 acre area on average that they're using. And there's one of our Ontario birds from last last year, and we haven't analyzed these data, but we can see it's a similar kind of movement. The females are fairly localized around the nesting area and concentrated in the forest habitat. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what we're learning about movement. So we all know broadwings are migrating. For us in the fall, they migrate in September. That's when we're seeing them all. So what are they doing as they approach that season? This was the very first female bird that we tagged, Abo. She was named by the donor. And Abo was nesting, if you looked in the far right corner here, down just east of Hawk Mountain, the little white splotch there on the Appalachian Mountains. And she had 3 young in the nest, and we actually had a camera on her nest, so we knew what she was doing day to day. And about July 12th, her last young left the nest. So they were all 3 out of the nest, but broadwings, as with most raptors, they require a lot of caretaking after they leave the nest. They don't know how to hunt yet, so they're following their parents around for at least a couple weeks, getting some lessons and getting forced to find their own prey. But lo and behold, Abo ended up leaving her young on July 13th or so and flying completely away from the nest site, but not in a southward direction. She moved north and west to this other area that was in the north, sort of in the central Appalachian Mountains. And this was the very first broadwing that we had tagged. And I thought, oh no, we have gotten a bad mother. You know, she's not taking care of her young, she's abandoned them. We visited the nest site, and the male was busy feeding the young. So he was doing all the caretaking, but she left. And since we followed Abo in the years hence, we found about 1/3 of the birds that we've tracked have made this kind of post-breeding, what we call pre-migration movement to a completely different area. And you can see that she spent some time here, and in this one spot, she flew out here for a day or 2 and then came back here and then returned to this other pre-migration spot before she ended up migrating in late August. So she spent over a month roaming around, doing whatever she's doing. Maybe she was doing that molting that needs to happen before they migrate. I don't know, but this is kind of an interesting thing. We did have one bird. Unfortunately, Abo did not survive to the next full next season. She survived to return in May, but got predated on her nest. But we did have one other bird, Penny, who was tagged, who we followed for 2 years, and she went to the exact same post migration or pre-migration stopover site. So it's an interesting behavior and something that we'd like to study more in the future. So, okay, so that, and the distance varied quite a bit, but usually within 24 to 65 kilometers or about 30 miles from their nest site. So let's talk about migration. First of all, definitions are important when you're doing science because, you know, when does migration begin? And we could all define it differently, but we defined it as we defined the start of migration as a point when a bird had traveled at least 20 kilometers from its nest site, but in the direction of that the migration would occur. So south in the fall or north in the winter. And then we wanted to look at habitat use on migration. So we also identified what we call overnight roosts, where a bird just goes down for the night and gets up and leaves the next morning. And then what we would call true stopovers, where a bird is actually spending more than 24 hours in one place. And oftentimes those are several days. So we looked at whether long stopovers were different than short stopovers, and we used the 3-day period just because other researchers have used that as a mark of a long versus short stopover. And why are we looking at stopover? That's, you know, I don't want people's eyes to glaze over, but it's really important when you're talking about conservation of long distance migrants, because if they are needing certain habitats, even to spend the night, if they needed to be in a certain habitat at night to, you know, have a successful migration and survive, then those are the kinds of information that we need as raptor conservationists. But some of the things that surprised me is when you think about timing of migration and broadwing hawks and how restricted it is when we see those birds flying over our heads. You know, it's like 1 week in that migration, whether it's spring or fall, that we see most of our broadwings. But what we found is that the birds that were departing from their breeding territory and heading south on true migration were starting at vastly different times. Our adults in this sample, 8 adults, ranged from leaving on July 25th to September 12th, which is a huge range. And then they completed their migration on their wintering sites from mid-October to January 1st. Again, very, very different. Spring migration was the same. We had birds initiating a spring movement as early as December 8th and as late as February 26th, and then of course getting back in second week of April or the first week of May. Juveniles, we only had three juveniles that we ended up tagging. Mostly they left in around mid-August or the third week of August, and then also had a wide range of arrival dates to their wintering areas. And Alberta, the 3 birds that were tagged in Alberta, all started their migration in that first part of September and ended sometime between the end of November and end of December. So huge variation in initiation of migration was a big surprise to me. So let's look at this annual cycle again. This is where we're kind of informing the general biology of the bird. And remember I said that we could have birds that finish their migration as late as January 1st. So this line here obviously needs to get extended in this our understanding, as well as birds that are starting probably in December. We need to extend the line a little bit farther here. So when you have a telemetry unit on a bird, we were getting signals because these are small raptors. We're not getting signals every 30 seconds like you might get on an eagle or a big vulture. We were getting signals about 5 or 6 times a day, and we had the units programmed to go off for 24 hours so that we could save the battery life. And that was because we were trying to get more than 1 year's data out of these units. Each unit costs about $3,500. The data costs us about $50 a month. So it's a pretty big investment of cost. But so all these birds are leaving at different times, but notice something here. In 2016, the stars here indicate where the birds were on September 15th. And what I see here, even birds from Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Pennsylvania are coming in on about the same latitude or area of the Appalachian Mountains on that date. This one bird, a little bit of anomaly, Patty over here in red, but everybody else was kind of clumped together. The same thing in 2014, we see all 4 birds that we tagged were all in the same area of Virginia, West Virginia in the mountains. So what's happening, I think, is that birds are starting off their migration at vastly different dates, but as they move south, they start to become more and more synchronous in their migration. And they do that because some of them are stopping and they rest. Some of them are stopping and resting and probably feeding for a week, and others are stopping for 1 day. So as they continue south, they become much more synchronous. And we see that with even more emphasis when you look at Veracruz River raptors, where most broadwings that nest in the North America pass through this very narrow corridor in eastern Mexico, where you can see this little white dot. And we had all of our Pennsylvania broadwings passing through within about an 8-day period of September 24th to October 3rd. And the Alberta birds, which were only 3, were all within a 3-day period. So as the birds are moving south, they're becoming much more synchronous, much more concentrated in flight. It's becoming much more of a movement, so to speak. So here's a summary of bird movements of the female birds on the left, mostly female birds on the left. Pennsylvania birds are in solid lines. The dotted lines are the Alberta birds. And you can see kind of how they're moving across the landscape and then where they ended up. I should say this is both fall and return migrations. And these wavy lines that you see here are spring, 2 birds that returned in spring kind of on a different pathway. And I can talk about that later, but it was mostly due to weather systems that were sitting over Texas. But in general, what we found is that birds go down from Pennsylvania, go down the Appalachian Mountains. Even if they're from Western Pennsylvania, they're following the Appalachian Mountains down, hitting the Gulf Coast, following that through Mexico, Central America, and then when they get to South America, they're dispersing into the direction of their wintering areas. Most of our Pennsylvania broadwings wintered in Peru, Brazil, and Colombia, the adults anyway, and the juveniles stopped in Central America. I'll show you that soon. Only one of our male transmitters actually ended up working. The blue here is one of our females, and you can see the male is following almost the exact same pathway down. He ended up wintering in Brazil. So on average, the length of a migration is about 3 months for a broadwing hawk, 90 days. And during that period, the birds are traveling on average about, the adults about 5,000 miles, the juveniles about 3,200 miles. And that's because the juveniles, the 3 that we tagged, and keep in mind this is a small sample size, so we certainly need to look at this with more depth. But the juveniles that we tagged anyway only wintered in from Mexico through Panama, whereas all of our adults wintered in South America, as you can see here on the left. And the bird, what's interesting here is the Alberta birds came down through the same flyway in Central America, but then 2 of them went into northern South America, went east into northern South America, and 1 of them went on to Brazil. So this was a suggestion that there may be some different wintering areas for birds deriving from different parts of the breeding range, and that's something that we're hoping that we can look at more by tagging birds from different areas. And this is more than a scientific exercise, because we know there's vast changes occurring, both on breeding grounds and on the wintering grounds. And it's really important that we understand if different populations, or if even different segments of the population, I don't know really where males are going compared to females. We only had the 1. So if there's a difference, then that has conservation implications. Spring migration, we only had 1 juvenile returned from spring migration. It did kind of a weird path here. We don't know for sure if it died or didn't, or if the transmitter died. We just don't know. And that could be the same for the other 2 juveniles. Most of the adults came back the same way they went down, but a few of them did make a wider path through central United States. And when we looked at what was going on in Texas at that time, there was like a 1-week-long rainstorm, and it looked like they were just trying to get around that rainstorm. But for the most part, the birds are going down and coming back the same pathway. So one of the questions that people often ask is, how fast are broadwings flying? I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly. They actually don't go that fast. You know, these are soaring birds. They're spending a lot of time soaring up high and then gliding on. So that's pretty slow flight. But the fastest we found was in the southern US and northern Mexico, where birds could be going as much as 226 miles per hour for the Alberta birds, and maybe 150. I'm sorry, I'm not rate of travel, but the distance in one day, 226 miles in one day versus 80 miles for a juvenile bird. So a lot slower for the juveniles. Now here's an example of a bird that we tracked for several years, Rosalie in the blue here. The yellow is the male. Both of them came from Hawk Mountain, but were from a different breeding pair. And Rosalie, you can see every year was following the exact same pathway, back up and down and back again. And we thought in 2019, when she was heading down in September, all of a sudden her transmitters stopped moving. And we thought the worst, that maybe something had happened to her. So this was in Louisiana. I tried to get somebody to go out and look for, we had a pretty good signal on where the transmitter was, but they were unable to find it. So we just threw up our hands and said, oh, well, this is what happens in nature. And we waited until the next spring. So from September 2019 all the way till this past spring, when we were all dealing with COVID. And we went out to look for her and went back to her territory, we found a nest, then we put a telescope on the nest and waited. And lo and behold, there she was with her bands, color bands showing, and we knew it was her. but she must have dropped the transmitter, which is exactly what you want to have happen. You want the birds to drop the transmitters, and they're designed that way. The thread is designed to wear out eventually. So that was good news. A good news in the middle of all that COVID craziness was really welcome. And indeed, she actually nested the best ever that last year. She had 4 young that also successfully fledged. And we just found out this week that she's back again. So who knows what's ahead for Rosalie. You can see I get a little attached to my birds. America was one of the juveniles that we trapped, and I just wanted to show you what a stopover site looks like, and what it looks like. What are the birds doing? So what are they doing when they stop? This is a you can see he was here in this area for about, she was in this area for about 20 days. This is in Chiapas, Mexico, and moving around quite a bit. And I would hypothesize that this bird was hunting and looking around for food and replenishing resources, because on October 28th, it took off and it flew further south into Panama for the winter. So stopover sites could be really important for long distance migrants like broad-winged hawks, because undoubtedly they need to replenish their resources at some point. Another stopover site that was really interesting was this bird Sadie, who came from eastern Pennsylvania. She stopped over 3 times, actually, twice in the fall and once in the spring twice in the fall in Virginia. And then I'll show you another one where she stopped 3 times in Colombia in the same spot. So she was very faithful to her stopover sites. And this is something that we haven't really looked at too closely, but it's something that would be interesting to look at in the future. What is it about these sites that makes them go back year after year? This is in Shenandoah National Park. And then this is the site in Colombia. It's in northern Colombia. It's also within National Park. And we have 2 of the spots mapped here, but she actually stopped once in the spring as well. So 3 different times that she was transiting from her wintering area in Peru, she stopped in northern Colombia. So when we look at all the stopovers, they range in length from about 3.6 days for adults, or for Pennsylvania adults, 2.5 days for Alberta adults, and pretty long for the juveniles, which suggests to us that maybe, as we would suspect, the juveniles may be less capable at hunting and finding food, and they may need longer stopovers. There was anywhere from 1 to 12 stopovers per journey, whether it be fall or spring, but on average about 4 to 5 stopovers during the migration in the fall. And then in the spring, slightly less stopovers, about 2.5. And this is a map of the stopovers. I know it's pretty hard to read here. The bigger dots are longer stopovers. The little dots are short stopovers. And we have different adults and juveniles here. But the main thing is just look at where they're clustered. We have a lot of stopovers going on early in the migration up here in Pennsylvania as they're coming down the Appalachian Mountains, and then not too much stopping going on through the southern US and Mexico. And then when they get down here into South America, you see a lot of stopping again. And I really think that this is a different pace to the migration, that the birds are probably really pushing from southern United States all the way through Mexico and Central America. It may be that they don't stop that much. They just do the overnights. They may not feed that much during this corridor where everybody's really concentrated together. And that strategy of migrating long distances and stopping infrequently is something called time minimization, and that's hypothesized to be what shorebirds do. They just put on a lot of fat, and then they migrate long distance and then stop for a couple, long period of time, then migrate again. They may only have like 3 stopovers in their migration. Whereas energy minimization means that they don't put on a lot of fat. They have to stop frequently and require somewhat slow movement. And I would say is that the broad-winged hawk is doing a hybrid strategy, in that they are early in the migration doing energy minimization, and then once they get up to that kind of level where they can have pretty good fat storage, that when they get to southern US, they do a time minimization and just try to get through that area as fast as possible. We wanted to look at what the habitat was for the stopover sites, and you can see here it's very, very similar habitat around the stopover sites that we're seeing around breeding sites. So these birds seem to be seeking out heavily forested areas on the migration. In the wintertime, we have similar kinds of data coming in, although a little more sporadic because once they get under that forest, the signals are not quite as strong. But you can see this is where our birds were wintering in South America. And we just finished in a paper that's coming out next month on the wintering habitat used by broadwing hawks. I'm going to share a little bit of that here. And before I do that, I just want to talk about fidelity. We mentioned before, they're very faithful to their breeding sites. They come back year after year, as far as we can tell. But they're also very faithful, it appears, to their wintering sites. And it's not an exact point, however, as it is in the breeding grounds. This is two years of data from Sadie. And you can see that she was within 50 miles or so of the same site in those 2 years. But what's even more interesting is that we had 3 different females from vastly different areas of the breeding grounds in Pennsylvania, hundreds of miles, 400 miles between one and the other, that wintered all within this 85-mile stretch of southern Peru. And, I really wish we had more birds tagged from Pennsylvania, because it would be interesting to know, is southern Peru just a place where Pennsylvania birds go, or this latitude at least? We don't really know. Now, we had 2 adults, one in northern Peru and one in Colombia and one in Brazil. So we did have birds wintering in other locations, but it was just interesting that 3 out of our very small sample were all in one area. And the male, Brady, also wintered in a similar latitude, but over here in Brazil. So when we look at the habitat the birds are using in the winter, just like in the summertime, it's predominantly forest, maybe even more forested, 88% forested, but really different kinds of forest. They're using evergreen rainforest and flooded, non-flooded, or montane evergreen forest primarily, and really away from human development. And of course, this gets into conservation questions, because if you have done any reading on what's going on in the tropical forests or the Amazon, there's vast changes being implemented down there. And you can see it when you zoom in on Google Earth here. All this little broken up area is areas that have been rainforests that have been converted into agriculture of some kind. Here we can see this here. This is right next to where Brady was wintering. And we can see it coming in throughout this entire area that the birds are using. So in our paper, Sandra Quadros, the lead author, analyzed the data to look at what kinds of threats the birds might be facing. Illegal mining is apparently a pretty big influence on the landscape in Peru, and about 1/3 of our birds were showing effects of that in their wintering area. And then, of course, deforestation for agriculture, as well as forest fires, which are part of how they clear the land. Other conservation threats that we're concerned about include shooting, which is still common in some areas. We now have a former Hawk Mountain trainee working down in Colombia to start some raptor conservation and monitoring down there. Esther, you may have seen her program on Humanis Lunch and Learn series, but here's a photograph of 2 Swainson's hawks that were shot in 2020. And so she's initiating some education in the local community to try to dissuade people from shooting these migrating raptors. And of course, forest loss. For these migrants, forest appears to be pretty important as a stopover site for the birds, probably safe habitat for even an overnight roost. And as forest loss continues, both from Mexico south through the Amazon basin, this is something that we're concerned about. So some of our key findings from the migration study have been that for Pennsylvania, at least, our adults appear to be wintering in Peru, Colombia, and Brazil primarily. The juveniles at this point, even though we've tagged only 3, appear to be wintering in Mexico and Central America. And the Alberta adults seem to be wintering from Brazil and then north and east of there in South America. We didn't find an elliptical migration route in pattern, which is something that had been hypothesized, is that birds would come down with a more easterly flow and then go north with a more westerly flow. We did find 2 birds showing something like that, but it seemed to be related to weather. We found the timing was very synchronous, but the initiation of flight, both in spring and fall, is highly variable. And then we found high fidelity, both on wintering, breeding, as well as some of the stopover sites. So what we're doing now is trying to get more birds tagged from other areas of the continent, other areas of the breeding range, so we can look at migration connectivity. We're hoping by next year to be able to tag males again. We'll find, if we can find a small enough transmitter that will last for a year or so, that would be useful. And one of the reasons we want to look at males is that they could be doing something completely different from females. Maybe they're not migrating as far. We know they come back earlier here in the spring. So, what is happening there? Is it just that they depart earlier, or is it that they're using different habitats or different migration routes? And we want to look at survival. Most of our loss of our birds appeared to occur during migration or winter. So we want to try to hone in on that a little bit with more scientific analysis. So as I mentioned, we're going to be tagging birds, possibly in southern Canada again, but definitely in New Hampshire and Connecticut, thanks to some support that we've gotten there. And we also are collaborating with Audubon and Nature Conservancy, sharing our data so that they can do modeling to see what areas need to be protected within the flyway. And this year, we're also going to be looking a little bit more at the nesting success in these more fragmented forests in the southern parts of Pennsylvania to see if lower nest success is one of the reasons the birds are disappearing there. So here's a photograph of Rosalie with the 4 young heads sticking up there, just to give you a little taste of our COVID hope that we had last year. And yeah, if you want more information about the project, I could be contacted at my email, and we have a Facebook page, and we have maps. Once we get some birds tagged in New England, we'll be sharing those data on a map that'll be updated automatically on our website. So with that, I think I'll end it and see if there's any questions, and I can stop sharing, I think.
Okay, thank you so much. It's just some amazing research. We do have a couple questions so far, and before I get to those, I just want to provide a gentle reminder. Go to your chat, open that up and ask questions, and I will facilitate asking those to Lori so she can get those answered for you. So Lori, there are a couple questions so far. One, you mentioned, hopes of adding more birds to your research and tagging more. So can donations be made to further that research and possibly help?
Yes, we are always looking for donations. As I said, it's a pretty expensive affair. Not only do the units cost us about $5,000 each when you add in the data costs, but we have to find the nests. So there's a lot of field work involved. But yeah, people can contact me, or you can donate on Hawk Mountain's webpage and just put in the comments box for the Broadwing project. But you can also email me if you want more information, goodrich@hawkmountain.org. We've had people sponsor transmitters, and then we give them the honor of naming the bird. And then you get personally invested. So it's a nice birthday gift for somebody. We actually tried to get some transmitters on some birds in Minnesota a couple years back, but the folks there were unable to trap a Broadwing. It was difficult, but we would love to do that in the future, not this year, but some year in the future. So keep that in mind.
So a quick follow on to that, someone has asked how much it would cost in order to be able to name and truly sponsor.
Well, it would be we're saying $5,000 to name the bird, because it's about $3,500 for the transmitter, and then we have to pay a monthly fee for the data. But feel free to negotiate with me on that to email.
That's funny. Okay, another question. So looking at the maps, with the birds taking the path through Panama to get to South America, are the numbers as good there as they are in Veracruz?
Good question. Not quite as good, but pretty good. Panama is a great place to watch hawks. I was down there 2 years ago. Some of the broadwings start to winter in southern Mexico, particularly your juvenile birds. So your numbers are higher in Veracruz simply because some birds are starting to drop out. But yeah, some of the things we still don't know are how different populations are going to look in terms of their wintering behavior. I presume Alberta is representing kind of the northwestern segment of the broadwing population, and Pennsylvania is kind of your mid-Atlantic. But I'm going to guess that the birds from New England and Connecticut, New Hampshire are going to go into Brazil more, maybe, which would have its own implications. But we don't really know. Maybe if they decide to migrate the same distance, they end up migrating possibly just to Central America. So who knows?
Okay, good. Another question. Any idea why there's no movement over the Gulf of Mexico?
Yes, most of our soaring birds don't like to cross water because they lose their thermal lift. And that's how they're able to make this long distance journey, is by saving energy by using thermals. So we don't see broadwings crossing water very often. There are some, if you talk to a meteorologist, they'll say there are some thermals over water. And so there's always a chance that some of them will do something. But in general, broadwings tend to stay away from crossing water.
Okay. Another question. Someone noticed in all the photos of the birds in hand, their tongues are always sticking out. Is that a fright issue, or is it just how they look?
They're a little stressed when we have them in the hand. So that's what they're showing there. And we try not to handle them for more than 30 minutes. From our observations, they go right back to whatever they were doing. There are some videos, I think on our website, or of birds with telemetry units in the nest, going about their business. So yeah, a little bit of stress is involved. And as you could imagine, if you're a free living bird and all of a sudden you got caught in a net and some big humans got their hands on you, but we make it as quick as possible.
Another question, someone's noticed that it seemed like a higher mortality rate was occurring during migration. So in general, is that the most challenging time for broadwings?
I think it is. I think it could be the most challenging time for most birds that are long distance migrants, because not only are they're having to face natural challenges like big storms or water bodies they have to cross, whatever. They also have these new human challenges, whether it be all of a sudden the habitat they were using last year is gone. And, I did have one sort of sad story on that. We had Abo, who I mentioned did not survive the full year the next year. She, when she went down to her wintering area, she was the one bird that did not show affinity to her wintering area. She ended up wandering around. And what happened was, when she first went south, she went into this area of Brazil that had been completely deforested. And then all of a sudden we see her turn around, and then she just starts wandering around. And of course, I don't know, but I hypothesize that her wintered area got destroyed by the agricultural practices that are going on down there. And then not having a winter territory, she was wandering around looking for another one. And then she ended up just wandering her way north. She ended up coming back to her breeding territory fine. But it just goes to show how there's all kinds of things that can happen that kind of put a bird's rhythm off, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, lots of comments, Lori, just thanking you for a really great presentation. And so we just like to echo that. And at this point, just thank you very much for taking the time to build the program for this Raptor series, as well as all the research that you've done and your willingness to share that. So much appreciated. And at this point, I think I'll go ahead and ask to unmute Sue and Kieran and turn the screen over to Scott for the last part of today's session.
I want to thank Lori as well. That was a really interesting presentation, and it parallels some of the work that the Raptor Watch is sponsoring this year with Red Tails and putting some transmitters on them, seeing where they're going. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Please remember, this is, or tomorrow, I think, is the last day that you can go out to Bidding Owl and bid on some of the silent auction items. We very much appreciate everybody's participation there. And to close the session, I'd like to introduce Susan Stewart, past board member, current committee member with the Mackinac Straits Raptor Watch. And Susan is going to make another presentation.
Thanks, Scott. I am happy to announce and present MSRW's 2021 Wind Under Our Wings Award. This is an award that recognizes the extraordinary contributions to the study or public education around birds of prey. And this year, the award honors the Little Traverse Conservancy, known to many of us as LTC. LTC has supported Raptor Watch in many ways. It has generously offered us behind-the-scenes services such as conference room for meetings and office-related support. It also, and this ties in so well with today's talk, protects the lands needed by raptors as stopover and feeding habitat throughout northern Michigan, and especially in Mackinac City and along the Great Lakes shoreline. Most importantly, the Little Traverse Conservancy is an institutional friend and a great model of how to do conservation right. Earlier this week, the picture you see is earlier this week, I presented Kieran Fleming, LTC's executive director, with an original painting of a kestrel by Glenn McCune to commemorate the award. And Kieran is with us now.
Thank you, Sue. It's really cool to be here with you. That was a wonderful presentation. It's great to see so many friends and friends' names on the screen. So on behalf of our board, our 4,000 members, all of our volunteers and our staff, we are deeply honored to receive this award, and we consider you guys to be just a wonderful partner in conservation. So thank you very much.